AP Computer Science A, Unit 6, note sheet. So this is the 2D array model. Kind of go over the basics of what 2D arrays are. And yeah, there we go. All right, let's try and get this camera set up nice. Okay, so we've done one-dimensional arrays and array lists before. And so just to go over kind of the basic idea, a one-dimensional array, we often kind of draw like this, right? And sort of like a sort of linear type of thing. It has spot 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a one-dimensional array. With a two-dimensional array, what we do is we add more of these. Okay, so what we do is we say, okay, well, let's make it's an array of arrays. Okay, so you have a one-dimensional array, and I can make another one-dimensional array, and I can make another one-dimensional array, and I can keep going. I can make, as many as I want. Now they're all going to be the same size, all these one-dimensional arrays. But the idea is that the two-dimensional array is a one-dimensional array itself it's a one-dimensional array that in each spot of the array holds another one-dimensional array. Now, this is the sort of the idea. So it makes sense that these are going to be the first things you reference when you're talking about a location, and we usually call these the rows, and we call these the columns. So you have rows and columns. So rows are like, which row are you accessing, the column, which column. So each spot can be referenced by its row and its column. Okay, so like over here, we have a board. We can talk about like a game board. This seems like a good application of a 2D array. It could be like a game board. And the board has 4 columns. It goes from 0 to 3, though, right? And they're numbered 0 to 3. And there's a you can use length that we've been using on one-dimensional arrays. And so if you do, I'm going to call it game board. If we do game board dot length, it's going to give you the number of rows. Okay. Because like I said, a 2D array is made up of these. It's a 1D array with arrays inside of it. Okay. So the first one is the rows. Okay. If we do game board spot 0 dot length, then it's saying, well, what's the length of this interior one-dimensional array? And so that's going to give you the number of columns. So it's good to know that because you're going to want to be able to get either size. Okay. Now you could put any one of these rows in. You could put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in here, and then do dot length. They should all give the same thing, but putting 0 in is the safest because what if you don't know how many rows it has? It should have at least one row if it exists, right? So putting 0 in, even though we could put any of these in, that's just the safest. It's also, it just kind of seems simple. So board has 5 rows, number 0 through 4. Game board dot length is going to give you 5, the number of rows. Okay. Now, how do we create a 2D array? So the way we create a 2D array is we say what kind of thing is going to be in it. They can hold primitives or objects. So int, bracket, bracket. So the double brackets indicate that's going to be a two-dimensional array. Okay. And then you give it a name. I'm going to call it game board. And then you say equals new. And then you do int. And then here, you put the number. I'm going to try and create the game board that's over here. We want to put the number of rows first and the number of columns second. It's always rows first, columns second, because the rows are like the first one-dimensional array, and the columns are inside those. Those are interior arrays. So it's always row first, column second. Okay, so that's important. You got to do row first, column second. Now, if you want to assign values, putting things inside of it, again, it's always row first, column second. All right. So, for instance, game board. If we put 1 comma 2 and we said that equals 56, where would that end up in this picture? So remember, the rows start at 0. So this is row 1, column 2. It puts a 56 right there. That's 1 comma 2. That's row 1, column 2. Okay. If you were to do game board 2 0 and say equals null, then that would be row 2, column 0. That would be right here. Now, honestly, we can't put null into an array of ints. If you tried to do this in your code, we'll try and do it actually. It gives you incompatible type, which is an error that we should be more familiar with. It'd be better to put 0. Okay, so we put 0 there. All right. Now, that's how we put things into a 2D array. Very similar to before, but you have two different locations you have to describe. We want to be able to get stuff out of a 2D array. For instance, if we want to print it out, we can do system.out.println, and we could say game board. And if we do 1 comma 2, so you always do row first, column second, this would print out 56. Okay. So you access them the same way that you put stuff in them, just like with one-dimensional arrays. That would give you a 0, 2 0. Okay. Now, how do we go through a whole 2D array? How do we traverse a 2D array? Because we often have arrays or array lists and we want to go through the whole thing. And by the way, we're not going to do 2D array lists, so we're just only doing 2D arrays. Now, there's different ways that you can go through them. The more common way is called row major order. The strategy in general for going through a 2D array is using nested for loops. Nested for loops. So nested meaning you have a for loop inside of a for loop. So, for instance, for int. Now, instead of index, I'm going to call these ones row. So row major means you're going to go through the rows first. You're going to go row by row. So row is less than. Now remember, we got to get the right size. Gameboard.length gives you the number of rows. So that's the one you'd want to use here. and then we're going to do row plus plus. And so what that does is that goes row, it goes to row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. Now, when we get to each row, we want to go through their columns. So that's where the nested for loop is. So we have another for in here, and we say int column equals 0, column less than. Now, I'm using column for the columns. You got to use a different counter. And column is very appropriate in this. Now, I have to do bracket 0, just single bracket, because that says, okay, game board, it's a two-dimensional array, but it's really a one-dimensional array of one-dimensional array. So if you just put one bracket, it just thinks you're going to the rows, and that goes to row 0. And you do dot length on that, and it gives you the length of row 0, which is the number of columns. And so if we do that, and now if we want to print everything, let's just keep it simple. Or let's say we want to go through, traverse the whole 2D array and put values in. So we could do, I'll just do an example, game board, row, column, equals row times column, whatever. So spot 0, 0 is going to be 0. Spot 0, 1 is going to be 0. Spot 1, 0 is going to be 0. 1, 1 is going to be 1. 2, 2 is going to be 4. And multiply them together. It's just an example. So you could do other stuff. Now leave a little space here, okay? Because I'm going to come back and talk about something else. I'm going to want to write one more line of code in there. So this end inner for loop, okay? That's the inner for loop. And then let's leave a little space here and do end outer for loop. Okay. Now, this will just print everything that's in the 2D array, but it's going to print all, well, or won't necessarily print it. Let's see. Okay, let's act like we're going to print it. And that's what we're going to add right here. As we go, I'm going to do system.out.println, and I'm going to do game board row column. Okay. And now, if we did that, would it print it out? How would it print it out? Well, if we did that, it'd print them all out on just one big column. It would print all of these, and then these. This would be the first one, and then this would be right below it. Right, everything would be in one big column. Now, if we want to print it out the way it looks, which might be a nice thing, we don't want to do a new line every time, okay? Because we want to do the whole first row all at once, right? And then we kind of want to maybe space them out. So we could add like a tab. All right. So that would kind of make it nice. Now, here's the deal. After you print the first row, we do want the next row to be below it. So right here, after each step of the inner for loop, you would do a system.out.println with nothing in it. And then that would kick it down one, right? That would help you. So after each row, use this to get to the next row. Something like that. Okay. So this right here adds space between each value. So these are all kind of tips for how to print out a 2D array. How how to print it out in a nice format. These little extra things right here, kind of helpful for that. Okay, now that's called row major order because we're going row, 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 right? And then we do the columns in each row. You can do column major order instead. You could do, instead, you could go column, 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 column. You could start with the first column, second, third, fourth column. In each column, you do all the rows. So that's called column major because you're going through the columns first. Now this is populating, which means getting values in, which we're doing, but we're also printing values out. I mean, you can use both of these, but I'm going to show you column major. So column major is you have a for loop, but you're going to start with a column. So you're going to say column equals 0, and column is less than game board. Now you're not going to do game board dot length because that actually gives you no rows. So this is where you got to use the bracket 0 dot length. And then you do increment your column, column plus plus. And then you'll have a nested for loop. And then, so this goes column 0, 1, 2, 3. And then for each column, we're going to go through all the rows. So row equals 0, row less than game board. Now don't put any brackets on here because if you just do this, this will give you the length of the original array and the 2D array, the most outer one, which is the rows. So that's going to be row plus plus. And then we could do the same thing we were doing before. We could, if we were going to print them out, we'd say, okay, well, system dot out dot println. We want to do the ln though. And then you could do game board, row column. And then if you're like, well, I want to tab them, you could do that on a separate system.out if you want. Last time we did it together, you wouldn't want that ln, you wouldn't want the new line, but we could do /t quotations. So end inner for loop. And then you would want to print a new line, system.out. Println. And then we could close it in outer for. Now, the thing about this is that when you do it column major form, it's going to look sideways because it's going to print this column as the first row, the way we have it. There is no way in the output window that you can print this way anyways. You have to print row by row by row, like line by line. We've never been able to do anything else other than that. So now, even though we're doing columns first, row second, we always put row first, column second when you put in sort of the address. So, anyways, those are the notes. We're going to go ahead and type this out together in our next lesson. You could go ahead and start typing it out if you want, but we're going to just type it out just and kind of play with it and see how it works. So we'll do that in a separate video.